All right, folks, sorry again to interrupt your conversations here. We are going to allow this conversation to wrap up in a natural fashion. We're going to give our Excellence in Government Fellows a bit of a chance to reconvene to kind of discuss what they've learned from these breakout sessions. And we are passing around at the moment a bit of a discussion document to help sort of structure the last part of this discussion. I know I've lost it. And I've been trying to use my best, my best gravelly voice here, but I got nothing. The what? Yeah. What's that? Nice. Oh, okay. Soft voice like so. So we're glad to see that there has been again some engaged conversation around the tables. We will have a couple more minutes to wrap up here. What we do want to give is just a chance for our Excellence in Government Fellows to sort of reconvene. They're going to provide a readout of the discussion that we've had so far. There will be a chance too, just coming up, to have another open discussion. What we would ask you to do, so we've passed out a discussion document. The intention here in the last portion of our afternoon is to drive our discussion back to what we can actually do in terms of web presence, in terms of activism, to help move forward some of the priorities that we have surfaced in the course of this discussion today. So I'd ask that you just have a look at those discussion documents to see the sort of priorities that we're interested in. And we'll have a readout from the Excellence in Government Fellows just shortly. So it'll be about 5-10 minutes.
No, I don't think so. We'll let people come back in. Actually, Kirsten. Yeah, well, just like it's very her. Right? We'll certainly be delivering it. Yeah. All right. I think we're ready to move on to the next portion of the program. Okay, so again, on behalf of the Excellence in Government Group, we just want to thank you all very much for the conversations that we just had. Certainly, we tried to debrief in 10 minutes. I think we could have gone on for a whole nother session of this, about 5 hours, about what was just discussed. But we just wanted to capture some of the things that were discussed at Table 1 might not be the same things that were discussed at Table 5, just because we all have different experiences and different backgrounds. But we wanted to catch some of the high-level things. And please, while I'm doing a little bit of the readout, if something does spur an idea, this is going to lead right into an open discussion portion. So if you have any suggestions or any comments or questions that you want to explore further, please kind of raise your hand, interject. So we had a few main focus areas. The third focus area about the usability functions in the web portal, all of that information, while we did get some great information, but that's all going to be delivered to DOL to kind of wrap into the new web portal that they're designing. So we won't touch on that here, but it's definitely going to be delivered, and we'll type it up nice because our handwriting's terrible. So the first focus area was identifying barriers to startup and scale. Some of the common things that were discussed at each of the tables were one major point, and please, if you have comments, I think that's something that we should definitely discuss further, was getting industry to the table. If we're looking around the room right now, we'll notice that there's not one person representing industry. We have intermediaries, or maybe only one person, the one and only. And how do we do that? 2? Okay, I'm sorry. It's a small ratio of everybody here. Right. How do we, and if you have a comment there, how do we better involve industry? How do we get them to the table? And how do we deliver a consistent message about cybersecurity apprenticeships to industry? And if you have any comments. Yeah.
One of the things we started to do in NICE is not just pick on industry, but use the word employers.
Employers.
Because where's the federal government? Where's the state government? Where are the nonprofits? So it's really not just industry, but where are the employers of apprentice?
Yeah, that's a great point. And a couple of one of the other main themes was a branding of cybersecurity apprenticeship and just IT apprenticeship and apprenticeship in general throughout the country. There's a lack of consistency there, and whether from the state level or from the national stage, the national level, there's a lack of branding. How do we communicate that to industry, to government, to academia in a clear, consistent way? And how do we facilitate that conversation so that when somebody does mention cybersecurity and apprenticeship, you have an idea of what they're talking about, and it's a consistent idea. While people have their different interpretations and things like that, it's not, how do we start to develop that national framework and identity across there? Another one was funding. Whether it's federal WIOA grants or whether it's state grants, or are companies and employers themselves, are they fitting the bill? How do we get different funding, and how is that being approached throughout? Then recruitment, how do we involve the general public in knowing that the cybersecurity apprenticeships and just IT apprenticeships in general are there. How do we get that message out? Whether it's like, do we start, like Sue mentioned earlier, do we start pitching it to middle schoolers, to high schoolers, or how do we engage the different groups from different backgrounds? And then going into the second, the focus area, sharing best practices for reporting and tracking. One common theme was what's good for the government is not good for the employer, and all in every single, and I see some nodding heads over here. Industry, the definition of success to industry and to employers looks a little bit different from definitions of success for the government, for states, things like that. Then it talked about, industry retention and certification standards. While there are standards that are out there developed by different entities, they are at some times in conflict with each other. And please, if I'm missing anything that, actually, if I'll change this rather than me stuttering up here for the next 5 minutes. Is there anything that was discussed at your table that I didn't capture that you feel as though you wanted the opinion of somebody else in the room? Katie.
Oh, Joe. Sorry, that's okay. Scared me.
We've got a lot of, just heads up, we've got a lot of interns and ex-interns running mics, so if we're seeming a little jumpy, that's why.
Sorry about that. One of the things under focus, the focal area one, the standards of the cybersecurity programming, and how do you address that across the board? And there seem to be differing opinions that yes, there are standards, but maybe that's not communicated as well as it needs to be. And do you have standards by state? Is it national for certain groups? So anyway, so that was one of the barriers, I think one of the challenges that folks were worried about. And level of consistency, and that certainly came up as well when you're addressing standards and funding and the messages and everything. So I just wanted to touch on that. Thank you.
Yeah, and then something that came up a couple of times was, and you just mentioned it, was this communication to whether it's the general public or to industry to get more people on board with everybody, with what we're all here for, what we care about, how to push this forward. Does anybody have like any kind of opinions or ideas? Where do we take this conversation from here? And how do we leave with something actionable? How do we put the message out? Should it be done by the federal government? Should it be done small grassroots? Should it be each of us like going out to different employers or regional, or what do you feel as though should it be done at the grassroots level? Should it be done from top down, bottom up? Where are we at with that?
Two quick suggestions. One is we really need to start a three-way conversation between the educational community, the human resource community, and the employers, industry, let's call it. In order to do that, we can't keep on going to conferences and saying the same thing over and over to the same people. We have to somehow create a different dynamic. The French have a way of organizing regional discussions where they open up the doors and let people come in, and they develop some kind of a big idea about where France should go next. I think we're at this stage now where we need some regional discussions between HR people, educators, and people who actually need the talent. That's it.
I know I've said this before, I'm going to say it again. There seems to be a huge opportunity in this excellence in government, thinking through this is a unique space where the government doesn't have to be a sort of secondary actor or someone that's supporting policy and hoping for action. The government is a huge employer. The government can send a signal. The government can demonstrate and role model for private industry what this is about. The biggest pipeline program for cybersecurity professionals is already the government through the military. why we shouldn't be exploring some level of public service pathway, whatever it might be, maybe working more through championing the work of state and local government who need cyber talent but can't compete against the salaries in the private sectors who have a greater incentive to invest and train. Why we wouldn't use this opportunity, this group, the fact that we have this cross-agency commitment infrastructure to try to move the ball with OPM or whoever it is to do this. If we can't get it done on that level, why not? Why would we expect something too much different from large industry at this point? So that's the challenge, I guess, I would issue to the group.
Yeah.
But I'm going to dovetail off the end of that, and I think you're onto something in terms of who needs to lead the adoption. But I also think that if you want private sector, who is now, particularly when it comes to cyber and technology, historically fixed its own problems because it's innovative and it's nimble. It knows how to do that, and is finally hitting a tipping point where we have to find another pathway or additional solutions to solving our staffing issues. So if you want industry to come to the table and be an active participant, the only one who can bring them there is government and a public-private partnership. But that means putting dollars on the line, making financial commitments and strategic investment in how to stimulate this adoption in a way that industry finds acceptable, not that is forced government infrastructure. And when I say public-private partnership, I don't mean this idea of an industry-led program. I mean actual investment in the outcome that the government still leads the credentialing of this so there's consistency in the model, but is supporting the adoption by industry while industry is growing into that space as a new leading field.
So to your point, we have actually had conversations with OPM and vets. So those conversations have been started. So just kind of want to let you know that we are exploring that. I think that's a great segment to have the public-private partnership kind of going to, so the private industry can see what we're doing in the public space. Also, to Neil's question about where should this start, I think it needs to start everywhere, right? So the federal government, from my role, I can take that website and I can start taking some ideas that we're developing here and making sure that there's, I guess, we're talking about educational opportunities, what options are out there, like Cybrary, is the federal government offering that we can post there that's like a resource for people. In addition, I think that there's got to be regional initiatives, there's got to be state initiatives. Get the chambers of commerce, get the local workforce board, get the offices of apprenticeship all together, and let's all talk about it. So I think that we can all make an effort to expand this, hopefully on a large scale.
I'm going to add again, sorry, but part of the conversation needs to be about the public policy that can be driven. Because a lot of the changes that will bring industry to the table are policy related and will structurally be able to streamline access to things, whether that's a change in policy around anybody doing business with the government on a contract basis can't hire somebody with a record, right? So that change has to happen at a government level, whether it's not just financial investment. WIOA is driven at a local level. There is not a consistency to their policy and how to access those funds. If we want to make it a worker retraining investment, then make it a simple worker retraining investment and not allow multiple layers of definition to go into each local marketplace. And if you can do that, then company might be quicker to engage and be able to take advantage of those things and not ask for additional or new funds to be set aside to support something.
So one thing that I'm not sure how many people in the room are familiar with, but apprenticeship utilization rates are something that are increasingly happening in the traditional trades on public works projects. And so from a policy perspective, those of you that work for the government, that might be something to look at, right? The government is a massive employer itself, but there's a lot of contracts out there. So apprenticeship utilization rates are a really meaningful way to help industry help itself, because they want access to those business opportunities, and ultimately that, if you tie their hands, they're going to go after the business opportunity anyway.
I was going to piggyback on that to think of your local city and state as employers. So our first cybersecurity apprentice is actually with the city of Albuquerque, and they're planning on taking more.
So in our space up here, the contracts don't have anything usable for apprenticeship. And it's actually a burden because a contractor can hire someone as an apprentice. That's not the burden. The burden becomes the 3 weeks a year that that individual needs to go through training. Even if you front load 2 weeks prior to that, they still have to take time off during that year of apprenticeship to learn the new skill and then learn, mentor in the new job or train in the new job. And that is a no-no. You can't give, if they're on a contract, they're on a contract. And that's where we need to fix that problem. You're exactly right.
Two thoughts in terms of what kind of employers or who within an employer should come to something like this. Number one, we probably ought to look at the small, medium employers who could benefit from a multi-employer model where each one of them may not be large enough to support a cohort, but which is what we're finding that, if you get 3 or 4 of them come together, and they can sort of start defining what the skills that they need and so on. That's number one. The other one is at what level at the employer that we would like for the people to come to these things. And I would submit to you that let's go with the decision makers. And these C-level people, I think they're looking at the numbers and they realize that not having open jobs and not filled positions is actually hurting their top line as well as the bottom line. And so we have a very good story to talk about return on investment. And it's been proven so many different countries and here. And so we could do that, but I think the only people that really would understand that are the C-level people. And so if we can focus on that and get the SMEs to come, we can probably start scaling it up in one way. And then maybe that should be done at individual state level. And from the heat map, it looks like there are only like 12 states that probably have about like 80% of all the openings. And maybe that's what our focus should be. Thanks a lot.
Carolyn?
So Girish, I agree. I think that the C-level suite is a good place to start. But from my experience and the people that I've worked with, I have a lot of people who have initiatives at different companies. For example, they want to hire on vets. They have a diversity inclusion initiative. So when they come to us with this initiative, hey, how can I get more vets in my company? Once they are sold on the program, then they go and sell it to their senior leadership, and it's a go. So I found that we've had a lot of success with that initiative as well. No, absolutely.
And I think that was one surprising comment I heard from, I guess, table 3 over here, was that perhaps the focus should be, Jordan, the focus should be on specific business units that could actually use apprenticeship towards the outcomes that they need, and perhaps less of a focus than on HR. That was a bit surprising to me. I think one of the parts of the conversation I've always been interested in is what HR folks think about apprenticeship. So I think that's one for us to kind of keep drawing out. Are there any other, before we want to focus the last part of this discussion a bit on what we can all do specifically. Did I interrupt? Sorry. Right on. I just wanted to ask quickly, so we've got a couple sort of public policy conversations that we mentioned. So WIOA, H-1B, criminal history might be something for Office of Personnel and Management. Sort of interesting kind of Davis-Bacon Act apprentice utilization thing. Are there any other sort of public policy conversations that we should be having around that, are maybe near term that would be valuable to bring into this conversation before we sort of look to more practical issues? Okay. Care to elaborate?
I think that all the apprenticeship programs should provide us a way of increasing local tax revenue, which is economic prosperity to the local community. So when you're out there talking to the employers, they all have initiatives to improve everything, their lifestyle, people's lifestyle, taxes, et cetera. That's why they get tax incentives. So I think we need to really also focus on what the employer benefits are as well, but also what the community benefits are. For every 300 cybersecurity individuals that get trained in Fairfax County, there's going to be an increase in revenue of $2.1 million and 1.1 more jobs, not just the cyber job filled.
Well, one policy discussion kind of along the lines of economic prosperity is, small business growth and development. It seems to me, just kind of looking from the outside, that there's lots of opportunities here, not only to grow this industry as a small business, to develop that talent, but again, I know it's been touched on a few times, but for small business to absorb those cybersecurity professionals, whether at an entry level or whether at a higher skill level. But also, one of the things I think we need to think about, I know Sue and I have had this conversation, and this comes up a lot, the veterans preference and a lot of grants, a lot of funding really caters to veterans, which I think is fantastic. But you're also blocking out, and considering there's such a need, you're blocking out a huge community as well. Where if you're not a veteran, then you do not have the ability to receive funding for a certain, from a certain grant. And that, I think, is a deterrent, and we may want to think about policy-wise, how do we attack that, where you do have this funding stream for veterans, but where's the funding stream for upscaling folks with talent? Where's the 40, 50-year-olds that find themselves not competitive in the workforce now and would like to be retrained, but really don't have a way to do that, and the funding mechanisms are not catered for them. So that's a challenge. And the same with youth, and focusing some grants on those youth programs. So really looking at your target, stepping back, looking at your target audiences, what are the needs of those target audiences to actually get to that point where they are competitive in the industry? And I think you need to start unpacking that a little bit.
So one of the things, and this has kind of been a general experience that we've had, is accessing WIOA funds is a really problematic thing, which is ironic because we're a registered apprenticeship program with guaranteed outcomes, right? And I think that's where that money is supposed to come from, is the local workforce development boards. But a lot of apprenticeship programs have a really hard time accessing that funding. So I would just put that out there. And then the other thing for me is, a huge part of our program's value proposition is diversity. Not just veterans, but women and people of color. But I think it's also really important to frame this aspect of it from a demand side rather than a supply side perspective. So when we're talking about diversity, companies, of course, want to help their local communities, but they also want somebody that's going to be extremely capable, right? And so just as you're thinking about diversity and inclusion and how that works in this space, in a highly technical, highly skilled area, not every person is going to fit well in that area. So finding the people that are going to be first and foremost good at doing the work, and then layering diversity on top of that, I think is really important to this being successful in general.
That certainly makes sense, but I hope that doesn't mean just a certain group has the capability of doing something. There could be the mom that decides to, at 40-something, who may have worked in tech early on and now is getting back into, was a stay-at-home mom and now wants to go back into cybersecurity, this growing field. What opportunities does she have?
Apprenticeship is absolutely that answer. I mean, we have a number of those who have come through the program. I don't think that's what we're saying. I think we're just saying that the message that we get, particularly from the workforce development councils, is that it needs to be easier. And that isn't the case when it comes to technology. I can't take math out of the equation, unfortunately. Pardon the pun. My only comment was going to be on the long-term investment, that this strategically has to be a commitment, not because it's the word of the day, but if we want to make a generational shift, and it will take a generation to shift and gain momentum in apprenticeship, that any investment has to have the long-term game in mind. This is not a 1, 2, 3, or 5-year endeavor. This is a 20-plus year investment that we strategically as a country, as well as businesses, have to be prepared to make. So we need to make the investment in the organizations. Operationally, they're going to stand this up. The way that the DOL funds things is on a year-to-year basis, and therefore it can shift dynamically to whatever the conversation of the day is, or as we even see in the granting world, it's, you know, we want this today, and that grant lasts for 1 year, and next year is we want this plus X, or this plus X and Y. And if we're not ever sticking to one thing and really gaining momentum with it, we're not going to see any kind of traction or success. And it's the tail wagging the dog. It's government or privateers who are offering the grant dollars up, running what they think industry wants and not actually responding to what industry wants.
We'll have Brent, or Dave, then Brent.
So on the government side, I mean, one thing we haven't talked about, but it reflects sort of the nebulousness of both cybersecurity and apprenticeships, just in understanding what each one of them is on the statistical data side. And statistical data, what we collect, what we produce, reflects our values, and our data on the labor market, our labor market information doesn't capture apprenticeships, and it also doesn't really tease out cybersecurity jobs. So because of that, the CyberSeek, investment on your end is really great, Rodney. But I think for long, I think we need to fix that in order to, I guess, as part of this total package of activities.
If I can piggyback on that, on the education side, it's very difficult to track students who are actually graduating from some of our programs, SFS, CAEs, due to legislation like Paper Reduction Act. So even us on the government side, it's difficult to see what that pipeline is really looking like long term.
One area I think that has good possibility.
Caught on video.
I was going to comment on one area that I think has potential if we can get the, particularly for the minority community, if we can get the historically black colleges and universities, which exist as a group and has people at the top coming into an association of HBCUs and so on. If we could get to that group and actually have them interested in offering either 2 or 4-year degrees in cybersecurity topics, and of course, in our case, I would propose secure software development as an example. But at least I think we can reach the people that are already enrolled in those programs and get them the right kinds of skills that the employers would actually hire them as opposed to just a bachelor's degree.
Thanks. So I'm tempted to dive into the question about funding. I think that is a really interesting one for us to consider collectively. Of course, there are some immediate questions. I mean, is this something that we look to private industry to chip in for? Is it something that government leads? I think one of the really interesting things that I've just drawn from our recent conversation is that there is a place for agencies to start to actually initiate the employer engagement sort of project of cybersecurity apprenticeships. One of the reasons that we wanted to have this event today was because there are, as we've discussed already, there are 2 sort of big and we hope very powerful initiatives going on in the federal government. So, of course, Rodney's work and Marion's work at NICE. The apprenticeship working group that Girish and Jennifer are leading, we hope can be a forum for continued discussion along the subjects that we've gotten into today. And then also Department of Labor, Office of Apprenticeships work building a new web presence to support the expansion of cybersecurity apprenticeships. And I think to end this conversation, I think I'd like to focus on what specifically that web presence can look like and how it can help these conversations that we hope to have more of with employers. It does seem from our conversation that the primary sort of barrier to expansion is employer engagement. And there were, rule of 3s. I tried to keep it to 3. There are actually 4 things that I think sort of came out of our conversation. Resources or functionalities would be important for a web presence to have. Of course, we've got the question of basic awareness of what is apprenticeship. Culturally, we're not especially familiar with apprenticeship, how it works, how it can integrate into a person's career. There are a lot of resources out there already. So the Department of Labor has plenty of toolkits about apprenticeship. There are other places you can find information. I think what might be valuable from my perspective for a web presence around cybersecurity apprenticeships would be something more targeted and especially concise to sort of describe what apprenticeship is and how it can work in cybersecurity. We've heard a lot about return on investment. One of the sort of comments I heard in circulating the room was that it's all well and good to have, for example, Department of Commerce did a study with Case Western Reserve on the return to investment of apprenticeships. There's a bit of a difference, of course, between a cybersecurity apprenticeship's return on investment and that for a construction apprenticeship. So something targeted, a return on investment study specifically relating to cybersecurity sounds like something that would be valuable to have on a new web presence. Third, we've had a really, an interesting, I think probably worth its own event discussion of the sort of the different perspectives of cybersecurity apprenticeship practitioners. So we've heard that there are some that are primarily interested in entry-level skills. There are some that are much higher level, which we can't really expect people coming straight out of high school or even straight out of college to get right into. It also sounds like we've got a bit of a division between cybersecurity apprenticeships that we should expect to require clearance, which should attract people who are either already cleared or can reasonably expect to be cleared soon, and those that can't. And I think we've, across those sort of two axes of higher skill and lower skill, and then cleared and uncleared, I think we've got an interesting place to start from, thinking about how we break out information in our own communications, and then also in any sort of federal website. And the last thing, I think, just to go back to what I think is one of the most important takeaways from this last section of the discussion, is the strategy that I think we've kind of distilled that I haven't really heard before in this conversation about how agencies can really drive employer adoption of cybersecurity apprenticeships. So those are my big four. We've got about 15 minutes left for discussion. Have I covered it all?
The one thing that interestingly hasn't come up, and might be the most direct way to address your employee engagement, tax credit. We give credits for investment in equipment. Why don't we give them a credit for hiring an apprentice? Well, make it bigger. Right? Money drives things.
So one of the things that I have proposed on a couple of occasions to my friends at the DOL is if you want to stimulate adoption of apprenticeship, then create a mechanism that says if you take a visa, you take an apprentice.
So we actually have heard a bit of, yeah.
And that you not only correlate the two, but the beautiful thing about that is as one market ebbs or one industry ebbs and another flows, there's an automatic corollary, just so long as it's not so overly prescriptive that you end up with us trying to produce data scientists this way. If you take a data scientist, which is the theory behind an H-1B visa, then you have to allocate it to a tech job. It can't be to a data science because we won't produce more PhDs tomorrow. But similarly, it also has to be if you take it for a tech role, that you're also not putting that person on a forklift in the warehouse, right, as an apprentice.
Okay, so something I just wanted to contribute with regard to providing information about apprenticeship programs on the website. If you had sort of a how to get started directed at smaller employers, small and medium, not only the resources in their state or community, but examples of existing programs would be helpful, but answer some of the FAQs of how to get started and why they should be interested in doing it, but specifically tailored at a smaller employer.
So when Laura and I were planning this event, one of the things I was in the process of getting a primary care provider for the first time, and I was sort of inspired by the experience of selecting a primary care provider through Blue Cross Blue Shield. It was not as bad as you would have expected. The problem was that when it was asking me about, do I want a nurse practitioner, do I want a family care doctor, do I want general practice? I didn't really know, yeah. So it's good. It was a great interface. I was walked through the experience. I didn't necessarily have the information I needed in the moment to figure out what my best choice was.
So my first intervention had to do with regional dialogues. The second one is going to be on the importance of national pilots. I think the time has come for some pilots where the research community, if I can call it that, can set some guidelines as to how to structure the pilots so that we learn something. So we're not just funding an apprentice program, but we're trying some ideas. and then do so at a national scale with the aggregator groups that I mentioned before, like National Cyber Watch Center or SHRM or Chamber of Commerce or whatever the right entity is, so that if the pilots are successful and they hit on the metrics that we have predefined in order to run these national pilots, we can then scale dramatically without funding from the federal government. Because cybersecurity is no longer a federal government initiative. It's you and me. It's every single industry that faces the challenge of cybersecurity. So I don't think funding is the problem. Funding is the problem to get going, to prime the pump. And for that, we need a small number of pilots done creatively and with some advanced guidelines to hit. Thank you.
I think the problem doesn't exist. I think the awareness exists. So every day, a large contract is awarded that demands a cybersecurity professional, and no one is paying attention to those. SAIC, CRC, GDIT, every single one of them have a requirement that when they got awarded the contract, they had to have people with a Security Plus or a CISSP or whatever else the award demanded. What we should do is now put in that next slot that says that they must have 10 apprentices for this value of the contract, or 20 apprentices in cyber. Because if they're going to put people with cyber credential requirements, they should build cyber professionals.
So I think, yeah, but I think there's another aspect to this too, right? And having worked for the government, I think it's really important that we develop more people that are current practitioners in this field to actually be champions of adoption and expansion. We have a lot of people in this room. I'm not a cyber expert. I know a little bit about it, just enough to muddle my way through a conversation, right? And I think that one of the primary issues that you have as a government trying to drive adoption in anything is credibility, right? At the end of the day, there has to be somebody that is credible and that doesn't have anything that they're trying to sell. And this is not to denigrate any educational institution, but of course you want somebody to adopt your product, right? You want somebody to value your product. You want somebody to value your curriculum or your content or your faculty or whatever the case is. And so in terms of getting more companies engaged in this conversation, I mean, this conversation really needs to be had with a handful of people here from government and education and a whole bunch of people here from industry that are current practitioners, right? And so I think for me, the first step is start developing those people. Because I mean, for our tech apprenticeship, that was a huge part of what we had to do, is get those people in the room on a consistent basis.
Just to piggyback that, we had the CyberSeek map, and it identifies, I think I saw on their top openings, or what are the top actual occupations. Like, do the intermediaries out there that are often working with apprenticeship, you know, maybe cyber's a new space for them, is it helpful to actually be able to translate that language when you're working with employers? Is there even a consistent language amongst the individual employers, though, about what types of jobs they're trying to fill? I mean, are we validating the CyberSeek stuff versus what actual employers are talking about when they frame what they want? It seems like that interchange needs to happen so we can speak globally about cyber problems, and that's something that the site should do. But if there's ways to profile, you know, who is apprentice serving in the cyber world? What are those jobs? How do those tie up? Are there stories of success with the particular jobs in CyberSeek? Are others, they're not showing up in the conversation? I think that's valuable information amongst that field of practitioners.
One of the things that I'm noting is that there are a number of questions that have been raised here today that are questions everyone in this room knew from the outset we weren't going to solve here. Questions about utilization of security clearances, of certifications, things like that that have been conversations that will be conversations. So my question for you is, what is that further work? What do we have left to talk about? And more to the point, what do you see as being the most effective forum for having those conversations? Obviously, the NIST working group is part of that. How do we transfer some of these issues that we're not going to solve in the next 5 minutes?
So building off of the last comment about CyberSeek, I mean, one caveat with CyberSeek is we're analyzing current job openings. There's a lot of interpretation trying to filter that through the NICE framework. And a lot of those employers are requiring advanced degrees, more skills and certifications and whatever that is truly required to do the job. So that's one caveat. But kind of back to the earlier comment, and I think Girish first made it, but others said it as well, is identifying a few work roles that are a good fit for apprenticeship and start piloting it and building it out so that we can have some successes rather than look, because the CyberSeek, like top cybersecurity job titles might have been what you're thinking on the homepage. Most of those, you know, like a cybersecurity architect is probably not a apprenticeship role, you know. You know, it's a different, yeah, right. Anyways, get a few quick wins. And I know this is already happening with some of the programs. They're picking a particular type of role, and that's what they're building the apprenticeship around. I think that would help us start getting some successes.
How do you get that feedback loop between the people that are selling, marketing, building apprenticeship programs on the ground into that information, so CyberSeek can filter and say these are the apprenticeable, seem to be the high potential apprenticeable.
And maybe that's a layer on the CyberSeek side.
Can I?
To the point of credit, oh, sorry.
I just wanted to add on, one group that I don't think folks have been talking about are the employees. Have you conducted any kind of focus group on the employees themselves? I mean, you talk about, we're going to have this apprenticeship program. What do the employers want? What are the educators doing? What about the potential employees? You probably need to bring them into the conversation as you think through what your strategy is on recruiting them and doing those general needs assessments on what are the actual needs when it comes to the positions and the jobs, and then what are the needs of the skills that need to be developed in the different target populations that you're going to be looking at in order to recruit. So, you know, bring that group in is certainly important. Getting back to your broader, what are your next actionable plans? Certainly, you know, one of the suggestions was doing regional workshops to really start kind of nugging out what action plans can be developed. It probably is a good way to start, as well as looking at some of these pilot programs, pulling out those lessons learned, and then kind of feeding them back in. That's always helpful. So I'll pass.
Just one note on the website, and this kind of goes to what you were saying. I think it's really important you don't put down jobs that aren't going to be apprenticeable on that website. So don't put architect level positions on the website, because it's going to immediately undermine your credibility with anyone that's a subject matter expert, right? So just bear that in mind. You know, data science, anything that has architect in the title, that's not an apprenticeship position. That's a career professional position.
So we've, I think Rebecca Lake has put cybersecurity technician, cybersecurity service technician on. That's the one registered occupation with a work process schedule that I could find on Department of Labor's website. Just, I mean, any immediate thoughts what the next occupation should be, what the next 2 or 3, oh, you got them right there.
There's actually
2 more?
Yeah, so information assurance specialist.
Information assurance specialist.
Network architect, security network support, secure.
Got it. Any others that come to mind? Cybersecurity analyst, okay, got it.
So even though they have that title, the employer can come on and change that title. So they can take that work process, the competencies, massage it to what their needs are, and we have multiple different titles that are correlating to information assurance specialist or cybersecurity support analyst. So if you look on our website on, I think it's innovative@apprenticeship.gov, they have, or org, I think it is. So you can look up cybersecurity support technician and see, like, I think there's 7 different titles that are going along with that. So again, it's what the employer needs and how we can work with them. And we don't want to have all, 100 different occupations. I think it's more so that we want to focus on the ones, just like you all were saying, what are really the critical ones that we want to focus on and move from there.
So it's kind of a commentary on 2 things. One is the word information assurance, and then the other is kind of, I don't know without looking how it relates to the work role, but I'm not defending the NICE framework, but if the work role doesn't describe something we want to label as an apprenticeship, then we need to fix the NICE framework or vice versa. But if we start creating a parallel system, then we're not helping educators, training providers to know what the KSAs they need and what to call that. So that's why it needs to be a two-way street. So we need to do that kind of mapping to the framework, either to improve the framework. My comment on the word information assurance is, we've really started to move away from that. I mean, it was a pretty heavy DoD term. A lot of the academic institutions were centers of information assurance, and now they don't use it. So we do a disservice to employers to suggest that's a job title when it's really a decade ago job title, not the title of the future.
I totally agree, Rodney. Excellent point. But I was also going to make, getting back to the working group that we have as part of NICE, the apprenticeship working group. We don't need to have one-off kinds of meetings. Like we meet here, then we're gone, and then maybe next year from now we meet again. But I think what the working group provides is an ongoing monthly way of getting people to connect and talk about the thing. And what I think, I'm glad Jennifer's here, so I think we would make the commitment that we would make time available so that if there are subgroups within the apprenticeship group is formed, that actually addresses some of these problems and creates some actionable items and make some recommendations and produce deliverables. I think we can make that thing happen. And so I would encourage for all of you to think in terms of, and that's how we started the working group, the apprenticeship working group, saying that this is the place to come to for a national conversation on cybersecurity apprenticeship. And so we're having the startup kinds of difficulties to get a lot of people to come and can actually contribute and so on. But I think it has a lot of potential if people would say, okay, that's one way of staying focused on this issue and having actually groups coming to meet not just once a month, but more than that, to create stuff that will actually start moving the needle back to where we want it to be.
I would make two recommendations to you. One, I totally agree with what you said about things not being apprenticeable in the way we're framing apprenticeship, right? Physicians, however, are apprentices, and they're at that other level, okay? So what I'd suggest is going to the comment I was made earlier about our data driving our decisions, is we need to find out what really are these job roles that are being demanded and not hide from it. If indeed 80% of them are cyber architects, they probably aren't, but if they are of that ilk, then we need to rethink what is apprenticeship rather than trying to put a square peg in a round hole. So the first place I'd suggest we start is data. That relates to the second recommendation, which is all this is wonderful. It's great meeting everybody here today. Some new faces I haven't seen, which is great too, because usually it's the same old crowd talking to the same old crowd. But these don't make things happen. This is never going to be actionable. Workshops aren't actionable. Contracts are actionable. So if you want to bring action to it, create a solicitation, fund it with sufficient amount of funds, and charge an organization with making it happen, or organizations with making it happen. But as long as it's just a conversation, great people, great ideas, it'll never happen.
It's an excellent note to
Yeah,
end on.
anybody to close it down on a slightly more optimistic note? Hold on one second.
I was just going to say, yeah, you're absolutely right, getting someone in to actually do it, but you need a plan in order to make that happen. And in order to get a plan together, you need the data. That's one thing that we talked about today. And you need to get that data so you can start making some assumptions based on something that's real. And then you can start developing your plan, your action plans around that. Because you need to have that structure in place, so then when you know what you want to do, then you go out and you develop the tender and you develop a scope of work and you say, company X, go forth, do good things and make this happen. And that plugs into your broader strategy. And then you start measuring the results and you have the benchmarks, and then you can kind of go from there. But definitely developing that strategy, having the goals, having the data that supports those assumptions, that's important.
So it sounds like another body of work then, collecting that data about occupations.
And you can do that through workshops, you can do that through a variety of sources, but you need to kind of pull it all together and make some sense of it all. Because
So my job in the next couple of weeks is going to be a little bit easier after this meeting with all of you all. We know we're going to bring in 300 qualified IT people into a cybersecurity training role. Hopefully that leads to apprenticeship because all of them need to be employed. 50% of them are going to be incumbent workforce. That is our goal, to take the incumbent workforce and make apprentices out of them so we can really gather data on what is the job role and what the job role means to apprenticeship in what we're intending to do. So the biggest problem we had, I'm going to share with you, is we were unable to get them employed because they didn't have any experience. So the experiential part of it is what I'm funding. So the new grant will enable us to hire. Security University won't hire them. We're going to put a team in place to hire the individual, to train them for 30, 60, 90, maybe up to 120 days before they get employed in a real job role. So as they finish pen testing, they're going to learn how to do scanning through a real company that we're going to build new contracts for free. We're going to go out and scan people's charitable networks and teach them how to do the job. At that point, they'll be able to go get a job in a data center or at some employer who's got that job role existing. And hopefully they'll have that job skill so that they can parlay what they know, which is IT, and move them into a job role that gets them to the point of, do I want to do this? Do I want to work for this employer? Do I want to stay in this career field? What do I want to do? Because they're still asking the same questions. Apprentices or potential cyber employees don't know what they really want to do. They haven't been in that job role before. So that is our goal. In the next 30, 60, 90 days, we'll be into that job placement, and then the next 12 months, we'll have some real answers. So I think the biggest thing people really need to focus on is building an experiential, some way of giving the person, when they finish training, the opportunity for some type of employment that makes them eligible for real, apprenticeable employment.
Thanks a lot. Neil, Carolyn, we are officially over time. Thank you all for your patience and your interest today, for joining us in this conversation. Neil, Carolyn, anything to shut it down with, or? No? Okay.
No, I guess on behalf of our team, I just want to thank everybody for getting together today. And thanks to New America and Carolyn, I hope that this was helpful, and Laura as well. So we got some ideas to move forward with, but thank you all very, very much. It was enlightening, especially for us.
And I just want to say thank you to New America, especially Laura and Mike and the Excellence in Government team. So thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Again, not the end of the conversation.